Hi folks, welcome back to my Kitten Reads, and this is my March wrap up. I read 9 books in March, but I did do a lot of rereading, so I felt the need for a bit of comfort reading if I was going to get anything done. I did read a few new things and finished off something that was a long-term part of my currently reading pile. So I guess we'll just get straight into it. I started my month by finishing my reread of Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is the story of Fanny Price, who at a young age is sent to live with her wealthy aunt and uncle at Mansfield Park because her mother has too many children to cope with and to afford. And she grows up there alone, apart from the friendship of her cousin Edmund. And she's sort of in that situation where she's the poor cousin and she's treated that way, and they expect a lot of her in terms of, you know, being helpful. And for example, her Aunt Norris, who's the other aunt, often treats her like a servant. And of course she falls in love with her cousin, but has to watch his romantic endeavours and the romantic endeavours of her other cousins when the Crawfords come to visit. So Mr. and Miss Crawford. And this is very much moving up into the place of my second favourite Jane Austen novel. I kind of love Fanny Price. A lot of people think she's a bit of a wet blanket, but I really enjoy her strength of character. She's a very religious girl and she's a very moral girl, and she stands up. She's doesn't seem to have a spine, but she stands up to people when it's really, really important. So when Mr. Crawford proposes to her and she says no, and her uncle is berating her because Mr. Crawford is a rich man and could, you know, and her duty is to marry well given she's the poor cousin, and she still says no because she doesn't trust his character. And I really respect that about Fanny Price. So that is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I then reread one of my favourite Miss Marple books, which is the 13 Problems by Agatha Christie. This is a selection of 13 different short stories set. It's mostly in a novel context, in that the first half dozen or so are stories told when Miss Marple is hosting a dinner for her nephew, and everyone they form this sort of club to try and figure out if they can solve crimes that each person at the dinner has specific knowledge of the odd kind of solution. And Miss Marple always wins. Then there's another dinner and it's the same at a friend of hers, the Bantries, and again Miss Marple always wins. And then the final problem is it happens in the village when Sir Henry, who has been at both of those dinners, is there, and Miss Marple knows who the guilty person is, but she has no way of getting the police to believe her, so she asks Sir Henry to interest himself in the case. And I just really love it. I'm not entirely sure why it's one of my favourite Miss Marples, but it really is. So I reread that. And next up, I was still on a crime kick, so I picked up this Agatha Christie crime collection, which has been on my currently reading list for over 2 years. It contains A Caribbean Mystery, which is a Miss Marple, and Taken at the Flood, which is a Poirot, which I had read, and I just hadn't read yet. They were both rereads for me, but I just hadn't gotten around to reading the third one in the book, which is the Seven Dial Mystery, which is not a Poirot and not a Marple, which means it was brand new to me. And so I picked it up and I finally read it, and it's a story involving sort of espionage and politics and, you know, young sort of aristocrats who end up in the middle of a mystery with a couple of their friends dead. And it was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it. So that is the Agatha Christie crime collection, featuring A Caribbean Mystery, Taken at the Flood, and the Seven Dials Mystery. Still on a crime hitch, I read Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. This is a Poirot. This is one of my favourite Poirots in terms of the TV show. This was a reread because when I was at university the first time in my final year, I sat down and I read all the Poirots and all the Marples. So they were always rereads to me, but I recently picked up this copy, so it was actually on my TBR. And yeah, so this is the story of Poirot. He's on holiday in Egypt, and there is a woman and her new husband on their honeymoon, except that said new husband used to be engaged to her best friend, and that best friend is now following them around on their honeymoon. And so there's this sort of triangle, and then of course the woman who stole the husband ends up dead while they're on a boat cruise, and it's trying to figure out who was responsible, because the woman who everyone would think it would be has a perfect alibi. So, you know, it's a thing. Again, like I said, one of my favourite Poirot's, so I really enjoyed rereading that. And I finally got away from my Agatha Christie's, and I actually picked up a brand new book that's been sitting on my TBR since last year. And that is Newt's Emerald by Garth. This is my first Garth book. I think I've read a couple of his short stories in various anthologies, but this is the first novel of his that I've read. It's a YA novel. It's a Regency romance with magic and with mystery, and it's the story of Lady Truthful Newington, who is the heiress of the Newington Emerald, and the first time her father shows it to her on her 18th birthday, because it's a magical emerald that's entailed to their family but can only be wielded by the women, it goes missing in the middle of a storm. And so Lady Truthful has to go to London and balance being a new debutante in London with trying to find the emerald by dressing as a boy, as her aunt's sort of nephew from France. And so she gets into all sorts of shenanigans, and of course there's a romance, and there's magic and spying and all sorts of fun. And I really, really enjoyed this. I read it all in one day, and you know, if there was ever going to be a Garth book for me, it's this one, and I really recommend it. I had a great deal of fun reading it. It was cheerful and fun, and the romance was very sweet. Yeah, and again, you know, Regency lady disguising herself as a boy, having magical, you know, spying shenanigans, trying to recover her lost property, her stolen property. So yeah, really enjoyable. I really loved it. So yeah, that was one of the new books that I actually read. Then I picked up my Kindle, and in the last week of the month, I was again, you know, feeling a bit blah. The weather was getting a bit cold. I'd had a bit of a neck problem, and so I picked up one of the things I reread quite regularly, and that is the 3-volume novel, which is why it counts as 3 books, called A Tapestry of Lives. This is by Jean Sims. It's a Pride and Prejudice variation. It's one of my favourite Pride and Prejudice variations, which is why I reread it so often. And yeah, it starts in the middle of Pride and Prejudice, when Lizzie is trying to convince her father, Mr. Bennet, that Lydia should not go to Brighton. Mr. Bennet decides to continue the discussion after realising how old Lydia actually is, and stumbles across Lizzie while she's rereading Mr. Darcy's letter, and therefore gets the whole story in the middle of the book instead of at the end of the book. And so he gives Lizzie advice on what to do, what he thinks Mr. Darcy's behaviour means, and what she should do. You know, she should get to know him better if she gets the chance. And there's a lot of backstory stuff, a lot of flashbacks in these 3 novels. Backstories built around minor characters, so the you know, how Mr. Collins has become the heir, why Mrs. Bennet is so frightened of Mr. Collins turning her out, a lot of Mr. Darcy's family backstories, a lot of the de Bourgh family backstories, and Mrs. Gardner's family backstories that Jean Sims has completely made up, and it just is this really involved kind of family history and journey, and it goes beyond the end of the original Pride and Prejudice novels, because of course Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth end up together and they get married by the end of the 2nd volume, but it also follows the first few years of their lives and Elizabeth taking her place in society, and her sisters, you know, going on to get married as well. Yeah, it's really quite fascinating, and I really love it. It's a bit of a comfort read. So that was 3 volumes, so 3 books but 1 story. That was A Tapestry of Lives by Jean Sims. And then I finished up the month by finishing my reread of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets via audiobook, which is read by Stephen Fry. I had a day at the end of the month where I was doing tedious work all day. And so I just listened to the second half of the book. And so this is, of course, the second Harry Potter novel by J.K. Rowling. And it's Harry's second year at Hogwarts. And there's something mysterious going on. Of course, because there's this house elf trying to stop him getting to Hogwarts. And there's a mystery because there's someone petrifying people in the corridors. And Harry has to figure out what's going on before the school closes down and before someone gets killed. So, yeah, not exactly what normal 12-year-olds deal with, but it's what Harry Potter deals with. And, I really enjoyed it because, anything read by Stephen Fry is pretty good with me. And I really enjoy Harry Potter. So that was my March wrap-up. Like I said, I read 9 books, even if most of them were rereading. But still, it's my smallest count for the year so far, but only by 1. Yeah, so let me know if you've read any of those books and enjoyed them and what you think of them. I did really well in March on my reading more than I buy. I only bought 4 books and I read 9, although they were all mostly rereading, but there was still some new stuff off there, and I'm really pleased I got that Agatha Christie crime collection off my currently reading list finally. So yeah, it was a bit of a crime month and a bit of a classics month, and a bit of a rereading month, and yeah, I will see you again soon. Bye.